Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 991 Dragon Slayer, Lucia. With the appearance of two other beings on the invading side who possessed enough power to easily compare to 7th Order soul evolvers, Hellscar and Crow immediately began to suffer despite the fact that a minute ago they had the absolute upper hand over their enemies. Both were furious and frustrated, and how could they not be now that someone had snatched the victory that belonged to them? Although Lim Qinyu and Han Jian were injured and could only call for 60% to 70% of their full capacity, that was 60 to 70% of two beings comparable to demon generals. Piwen Duandilan and Dia joined the fray, bringing 100% of their peak condition selves added to the power of Lim Qinyu and Han Jian. The number of injuries on Crow and Hellscar grew exponentially. It was only a matter of time before the two suffered wounds that would force them to retreat. Although this was not a battlefield from which one could retreat just for the sake of retreating, at least not for the demonic army that was bound to hold its ground no matter what. The appearance of Duandilan and Dia not only impacted on the two main battlefields, but also indirectly affected the larger battlefield where the invaders of the Golden Domain and the troops of the demonic army were clashing. The previously high morale of the demonic army began to fall, and the low morale of the Golden Domain began to rise. This was the consequence of having their strongest being defeated. Just at that moment, the movement speed of all the enemies plummeted as a great blast of frost-like energy covered the entire battlefield. Invaders with power equivalent to 5th Order beings lost over 40% of their mobility, those comparable to 6th Order soul evolvers lost 20% of their movement ability, and those who were comparable to a 7th Order general felt their movements become so stiff that in a flash they had lost 10% of their total freedom of movement. Focused will. A voice sweet as the song of a nightingale in spring sounded in the midst of the massacre that was occurring, and immediately after that the battlefield underwent a new change. The invaders comparable to 5th Order could now move with 100% freedom, as if the white frost covering the whole area could not affect them. On the other hand, invaders comparable to 6th Order now moved 40% slower overall, and the most powerful ones directly lost 20% of their total mobility. Dia moved his head to the side as his body felt stiff, and he barely managed to dodge a torrent of flames Crow had shot at him. Ha ha ha. Crow laughed like a lunatic as he began to attack ferociously, now managing to stand on equal footing with two enemies whose individual strength was already comparable to his own. You're the best, Lilith. Lilith stood like a goddess in the middle of the battlefield, and from her body came constant bursts of frost that blocked the invaders, but did not obstruct the members of the demonic army at all. She waved her left hand outward, and in an instant tens of thousands of obsidian-colored ice blades formed. With another wave of her hand, just like a bandmaster directing an opera performance, the tens of thousands of obsidian-colored blades were slightly camouflaged by the darkness of the universe and coiled in the sky like dragons as they flew at thunderous speeds towards different invaders. All those blades were aimed at the invaders whose combat power was comparable to that of 5th Order higher existences. And in less than 50 seconds, Lilith had not only saved the lives of several members of her faction, but had ended the lives of over 10,000 enemies. However, not even a drop of blood came out of the wounds of those who were pierced by one or more ice blades. They all froze in a matter of seconds into ice statues, and then exploded into tiny shards of glittering ice that floated in outer space like precious pearls. The change in the overall war was tremendous, and simply impossible to ignore. You have received? You have received? You have received? You have received? You get magic plus 75, strength plus 54, agility plus 83, stamina plus 25. You have leveled up and reached level 577. You have received 64 status points to distribute freely. Now this is interesting. Lilith muttered to herself. Going up a single level was incredibly difficult for her and any other higher existence, as it wasn't easy to find many good caliber opponents to kill and grow stronger. This war was no different than a harvest, in fact, just as Lucifer had said. If they treat us like cattle, then can't we do the same? Lilith licked her lips. Bitch. An invader who had just beheaded a 6th Order demon after 2 days of fighting charged towards the just arrived enemy. Many weaker invaders followed this man, who used a normal-looking sword as his main weapon. Everyone had realized that the new enemy was even more troublesome than the other two enemy generals. The other two at least could not affect the battlefield to a large extent in the short term. Furthermore, the invader leading the charge could sense that the beautiful female possessed great abilities to affect the masses, but was not as strong as the other two, and therefore he was confident in dealing with her. Lilith had an ice-cold expression as she watched the over 600 enemies charging in her direction. When her eyes landed on the leader's sword and she noticed that a powerful attack was being charged, her luscious red lips curved in a charming manner as she opened her mouth leisurely. "Do you really want to kill me, all of you?" She stood there without moving in the slightest except for the frost that was constantly coming off her body and making her black dress and hair of the same color dance softly. Although she had not made any big movement, all the invaders froze in their tracks, and those who had raised their weapons began to shake. "Your witchcraft is useless against me." The invader comparable to a sixth-order existence roared as if to express his strong will, and when he arrived in front of her at lightning speed the man raised his sword above his head, Molten Ray. "Do you really want to kill me?" Lilith smiled with no change in her expression even though the enemy attack was an inch ahead. The invader's sword froze in a dead stop as his eyes met the ruby-colored eyes of the woman in front of him now glowing brightly like those of a true demon. Although Lilith's lips were curved into a smile, her ice-cold glowing red eyes were certainly not smiling while she stared into the fighting expression-filled eyes of the opponent inches in front of her. "You." The invader gritted her teeth and tried to resist, but found it increasingly hard. "Look, your allies have already decided to join me." Lilith looked slightly at the over 600 invaders who suddenly turned around and began attacking their own allies before turning her attention back to the invader. "Giving your life for me doesn't sound so bad, does it?" She opened her lips a short distance in front of him, causing the invader's legs and will to weaken as he looked at that beautiful mouth of hers. A strange pinkish-colored mist with an exquisite sweet scent came from between her lips and was soon absorbed by the invader, who immediately lost all resistance, and as if his soul had died, his eyes lost all light. Lilith took a step back and said in a cold voice, "Go." The invader did not hesitate, turned around, and immediately raised his weapon against those who had been his colleagues seconds before. Unlike Shangguan Bingshui, who used practically none of her charm on the battlefield, Lilith was using her abilities to the fullest for the sake of surviving and killing her enemies. She was just enchanting her opponents, regardless of whether it was male or female. It wasn't like she had to kiss them or something to get the wanted effect. Shangguan Bingshui maybe seen it as a bad thing, but Lilith did not. At least not in the present, not after losing everything. In Lilith's eyes, as long as she could survive it didn't matter the method she would use it as long as her bottom-line pride was not affected. There were some changes now, of course, since she was in love and in a sentimental relationship with someone she respected and would respect at any cost. It was no longer just about surviving but also about protecting her loved one. Wars between beings of similar power were bound to drag on for a long time, and that was precisely the case for the war that was developing and getting bloodier and bloodier between the demonic army and the Golden Domain. It had been a total of 3 weeks since the war on the Wall of Chaos broke out, 2 weeks or so since Lilith stepped forward and joined as a support existence, but ended up doing much more than just providing support to the members of her faction, but also dispersing terror and panic among the enemy ranks. "Fire Sorrow, do you think you could do the same thing she is doing?" Lucifer asked with his eyes fixed on the distant battlefield. Before Lilith joined the battle, Lucifer had been forced to use the power of his soul armament from time to time in order to decrease the number of enemies or else the demonic army under his power would end up being overwhelmed. However, since she stepped forward 2 weeks ago, Lucifer had not even lifted a finger, something he was extremely grateful for as he needed to save his strength for later. "If it comes to slaughtering ability, then I can certainly match Lilith, and even surpass her quite easily regardless of whether she has powerful warriors under control using her charm." Fire Sorrow reasoned after a moment of silence. She looked at the back of the beautiful woman who was like a goddess that strangely no one wanted to get close to and said honestly, "But, if it comes to providing general support, I'm afraid I'm not capable of doing such a thing." Fire Sorrow was a genius mage with truly terrifying skills. In fact, according to rumors, she was the most powerful mage in the universe when it came to pure magical power. However, what Lilith was currently doing was not about magical power, but rather it was the path she walked, a path very different from the one Fire Sorrow walked. "I thought so." Lucifer nodded. He looked at the surroundings seemingly uninterested and said calmly, "It should be soon." "Lucia, do you want to go?" "I'll need Fire Sorrow to back me up occasionally." Lucia took a step forward and tightened her grip on her spear as she used her completely white eyes to look off into the distance. I'll back you up, but don't blame me if I hit you by mistake. Some things can't be controlled, you know. Fire Sorrow sighed and muttered, I really don't understand why we have to do it this way. Alright, Fire Sorrow. This time it's different, so naturally we have to act accordingly. Lucifer patted her shoulder and said in a serious voice, Lucia, don't let the bloody succubus die. Lucia nodded, and soon there were hundreds of tiny black lightning flashes, with silver edges, dancing around her body. Her 3 pairs of wings opened wide, and with 6 strong simultaneous flaps, her body became a blur. The force of shock caused by the high speed with which Lucia burst out all at once caused Fire Sorrow to be forced to gently cover her eyes. Seriously, she and I are both 7th order, but what's with that unhealthy physical skill? Fire Sorrow shook her head. She might think the same thing about your magical power. Lucifer pouted before sighing, forget it. When it comes to close combat, Lucia is the absolute champion. Even I can't beat her when it comes to pure physical skill. Did you forget? Her main class is Dragon Slayer. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 992, Mortally Wounded. At this point of the large-scale battle, there were no more enemies who dared to come close to Lilith. No one took the initiative to go and bother her, even though they knew she was the culprit behind the fact that everyone was getting weaker and weaker with thick layers of frost hindering their movements and forcing them to consume their energy to break through the ice, even though they knew it was only a matter of time before they get covered again. Lilith did not have the large-scale destructive skills of Fire Sorrow, nor did she have the speed and monstrous physical strength of Lucia. However, as long as she had an army at her side or an army as her enemy, Lilith was virtually invincible. Of course, this was because she was not being obstructed by any enemy capable of fighting 7th order beings, or even higher. Lilith was under the protection of 2 invaders who had fallen under her charm, while she occasionally formed ice weapons and used them to end the lives of some enemies. Suddenly, her expression changed, and with a single thought on her part, the 2 invaders comparable to 6th order soul evolvers stepped forward as she stepped back and waved both hands forward. Ice defense. Imitate. At the same time, Lilith's body shook, and what seemed to be a perfect imitation of herself, she and her copy became blurry for an instant. The 2 invaders under Lilith's control seemed to begin some kind of technique as the aura of their bodies increased and their weapons shimmered. Unfortunately, their heads were sent flying after a clean cut. It all happened in less than a second, and before Lilith could get too far away, a flash of bright light illuminated the sight in front of her. Boom! The obsidian-colored ice wall that had appeared in front of her was easily cut in half and then exploded into millions of tiny fragments. Swoosh! Bang! Followed by a high-pitched swoosh, the copy Lilith had created earlier was cut from the waist down and in the next instant exploded into tens of thousands of ice shards, just like what had happened to the ice wall. Lilith frowned tightly as she noticed how only a few meters ahead appeared an invader who looked a bit old in comparison to the others. It was a man who looked to be over 40 years old, which was a bit old compared to all the others who looked to be between 20 and 30 at most. Her ruby-colored eyes glowed brightly, and she released her charm completely, focusing it in her gaze and in her voice as she commanded in an urgent voice, "Stop. Your tricks won't work on this old man, you impertinent brat." The invader, whose name was Xietain, snorted. Her charm and skills were not working? Considering that she was able to affect even beings 1 stage above her own, there was only one explanation. The invader in front of her was a being comparable to a 8th order higher existence, an existence on the level of the leaders of the 8 major factions of the universe. Blazing slash. Seeing the huge crescent of flames blazing towards her, Lilith stopped her retreat, and a snow-white colored sword with what seemed to be a big ruby in the center of the guard appeared in her right hand. Void slash. Boom. As the yellow light and white light of both swords collided, an explosion that was much bigger than all the previous ones so far caused the entire battlefield to rumble noisily. From amidst a cloud of blasting chaos and blazing flames, Lilith was ejected and her feet slid across the void for over 100 meters before, with a fierce flapping of her 4 wings, she barely managed to stabilize her body. "I see you're not only good at enchanting men, but you're also good at wielding a sword." Swoosh! Xietain flew out of the cloud of flames and white lightning in Lilith's direction, already with his sword held high in preparation for a new attack. If it was any other 6th order existence, they would have already died in the first clash against a being capable of fighting a higher existence leader. However, Lilith was a peak genius in every aspect: magic, charm, and hand-to-hand combat. Consecutive flare. Frozen star. Boo-moom. A small groan of pain escaped Lilith's mouth as she hurriedly retreated. The other side didn't even care about the invaders she had under her control and directly killed them when they approached and tried to protect her. "You've been killing enough for so long, it's time for you to pay the price," Xietain bellowed. Just as Lilith was in trouble, the expression on Xietan's face abruptly changed from confidence to wariness as he hurriedly swung to his right. Boo-moom. Xietain was immediately forced back a few hundred meters since he had been taken by surprise, and when he finally managed to stabilize on his feet he looked over at his right hand with which he was holding his sword. A hint of surprise flashed in his eyes when he saw his hand trembling slightly. Looking ahead and seeing not the enemy leader but a beautiful young woman with white-colored hair and white eyes wearing a black-colored armor paired with a jet-black spear, Xietain narrowed his eyes as he actually recognized this person. "Looks like I'll be able to reel in a big one this time." Xietain smiled as the aura of his body began to rise when a strange red-colored energy appeared around him. "Although it's a pity I can't hunt Lucifer, you're not a bad prey." Spear Goddess Lucia. Lucia looked at Lilith out of the corner of her eye and asked, calmly, "All well?" Lilith nodded and looked at Xietain cautiously. "I'm fine, but this old man seems to know you?" Lucia looked at her new enemy, the first since this war broke out, and said casually, "Since we know some things about the other side, it is only natural that the other side knows some things about us." Lilith nodded with understanding. Lucia was a very old being, at least relatively close to Lucifer and Fire Sorrow in terms of age. This meant that she had been fighting wars against the Golden Domain for many generations, hundreds of thousands, and even millions of years. Therefore, it was no wonder that the enemies knew her, and she became famous after surviving so long. "Bloody succubus, step back for now, and keep doing what you were doing before." Lucia waved her spear and took a step forward while looking at Xietain icily. "Sure. Be careful." Lilith didn't insist and gladly flapped her wings to bring her body back as she looked at the two about to clash. Dragon Force. Lucia's voice had only fallen when her aura immediately grew exponentially. Small silver scales grew on parts of her face and neck, and her once completely white eyes suddenly gained a straight golden pupil each. "I see that you dash." Xiaolin's pupils contracted as with a sonic blast the woman in front of him disappeared and hurriedly raised her sword to head height in a horizontal position. Boom. Lucia's spear struck the blade of the enemy sword, but instead of break apart, both weapons continued together as Lucia pushed Xiaolin backwards, taking advantage of the momentum of her speed. "This little..." Xiaolin gritted his teeth and a flash of anger shone in his eyes as his gaze met Lucia's indifferent eyes, who using her wings as propellers continued to push him backwards. Tearing Moonslash. Boom. Lucia was forced back, but not even a second later she charged forward again and stabbed with her spear using a technique that lacked feminine elegance but certainly didn't lack power. Boom. 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 Lilith's eyes glittered slightly as she tried to follow the movements of the two with her eyes, only to be disappointed as both Lucia and Xiaolin were exchanging strikes and moving so fast that even she couldn't follow their silhouettes with clarity. All she could see were two blurs moving at lightning speeds across the starless sky, along with large spatial disturbances similar to exploding air spheres forming with each collision in the distance. Lilith thought to herself and quickly simulated different scenarios of a battle between her and Lucia. But she soon came to the irrefutable conclusion that even though she was capable of fighting 7th Order soul evolvers, unless she used the power of one of her firmament shards she would definitely end up dead in a matter of minutes. This was because Lucia's physical attacks were brutal, bestial, and death-dealing. She came too soon. I don't think it's a coincidence. Lilith looked back and somehow wasn't surprised when she saw Lucifer looking at her calmly. With that person being around here, it's probably impossible for him to miss anything. Lilith secretly shook her head as she realized that somehow her lazy faction leader turned out to be more reliable than he appeared. However, every battlefield was prone to change. Especially one as messy as this one. The reason Lucifer had been able to partially control things so far and even know that there was a powerful enemy in the shadows waiting for a good time to hunt down an important figure of the demonic army was because he was stronger than those enemies. He could not get ahead of someone capable of matching him in terms of power. Just as Lilith was about to head to the battlefield and continue her task as large-scale support, her expression changed slightly and her face turned slightly pale as she noticed the expression on the distant Lucifer's face change from calm to shock as his eyes grew wider and wider. Lilith had felt death many times in her life, and the number of times she had been more than half a body beyond the gate of the underworld was so large that it would probably be hard for her to write it down. This was one of those times. She sensed a frightening aura behind her, one that made the previous invader pale greatly. Dodge? Fight back? No. Lilith knew she only had a shred of hope if she activated the power of Scotty's will. Even if it ended up giving her away as the culprit in the annihilation of one of the worlds under the control of the army of heaven, that would already be a problem to think about later. Niffle dash. Unfortunately, Lilith underestimated the speed of her enemy to get close to her. The letters "I'm" died inside her mouth as a small grunt of pain escaped from her closed lips. A second later, a thin trickle of blood slipped from the corner of her mouth and fell on her battle dress. Slowly, Lilith turned her head and with ice-cold eyes looked over her shoulder at her enemy. This was an extremely old and wrinkled man, appearing to be in his 70s or 80s. He was all skin and bone with only a dozen white hairs on his black-spotted head and his eyes were sunken inward like those of a ghost. But his strength was terrifying. Lilith looked at the old man's right hand with which he held his sword, and following the direction it pointed, she soon found that just like the pain in her chest suggested her body had been stabbed. And judging by how her health began to fall so fast, Lilith knew immediately that her heart had been pierced from side to side. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 993, Beginning of Despair. Earth, around 4.000 meters below sea level. White hole, expel energy. As these words left by Xietain's mouth, the small milk-white sphere suspended just in front of his two outstretched palms quickly turned red until it reached a bright crimson color that illuminated over 5 kilometers of the surrounding area, giving the waters a bloody tinge as the color became deeper and deeper. Tao Xi had experienced many life and death situations throughout his life as a soul evolver. In fact, not long after waking up from countless years of deep sleep, he fought the young man in front of him, and if not for him fleeing the battle, Tao Xi could have died right there back then. However, in that instant when his reptile-like eyes were fixed on that white-colored sphere turning redder and redder, Tao Xi felt one of the biggest dangers he had ever felt in his entire life. Swoosh! The crimson glow that had tinged the waters became much deeper and large amounts of sea vaporized in a jiffy when from the sphere suspended in front of Xietain shot out a great blood-colored ray that in a heartbeat reached in front of Tao Xi and passed beyond. It all happened too fast. Shangguan Bingshui had not yet comprehended the situation and for the first time in years, she was stunned looking at everything that was happening without her brain and heart adapting to the terrifying roller coaster of emotions she was subjected to in a short span of seconds. No more than a few seconds ago, Shangguan Bingshui had witnessed the same energy beam that had shattered Kong Jun's defenses, severely wounded him, and pushed him probably several kilometers deep into the ocean, completely covering Xietan's body. She knew that he had more than likely died, but simply did not want to, and could not accept it. But seeing him standing not too far away, all covered in wounds and exposed burns with all of his equipment shredded to the point where he was currently almost completely naked. What Shangguan Bingshui felt was not joy and happiness, what she felt was fear and terror. Ah! A small sound similar to a little kitten's whine came out of her mouth as she wanted to say something, and it was then that she realized that there were still crystal-clear tears running down her face uncontrollably. Shangguan Bingshui looked at the hand with which she was holding the sword that Xietain had given her, and then looked at her free hand. She was trembling. Her whole body was trembling. Her legs felt weak as jelly and her teeth were clattering beyond her control. It was at that very moment that she was horrified with the realization that a split second too late on Xietan's part, a miscalculation during the activation of that unknown skill, the lack of that skill. A single change, the slightest one, would have been enough for him to lose his life right before her eyes without her being able to do anything. It was at that precise moment that Shangguan Bingshui remembered the words Lilith had said to her more than 2 months ago. A little kid who has lost nothing and can afford to restrict her power for such a childish reason wants to defeat me? You're still 55 years too young, brat. That was what that woman had said to her. But it was only now that Shangguan Bingshui realized that Lilith was right. She had lost practically nothing since the world began to evolve and from many points of view had gained much more than she had lost. She had no idea how terrifying and frightening was the feeling of helplessness one could feel at the loss of a loved one while she could do nothing but watch with wide eyes as the life of someone of utmost importance was extinguished in front of her, partly because of her own incompetence, or in this case, and even worse, because of beliefs that perhaps did not make much sense. As Shangguan Bingshui began to undergo a change of mind that would likely take time to fully settle in, Bai Zemin winced as he lowered his hands. He really didn't die even with that. He gritted his teeth as he read the message that flashed in his eyes. You have received the soul power of 3rd Order Xian Kuan level 134. You. Previously, Bai Zemin had placed himself in a position where after taking that strange beam, he managed to have both Tao Xi and Xian Kuan in a perfect straight line. Thus, even if Bai Zemin could not kill Tao Xi, he would at least be able to end the third prince's life the moment he returned the beam attack, since even though Xian Kuan was imprisoned by the formation that Kali and Meng Qi worked on for a long time, there was still a need to get past Tao Xi to kill him. The 4th Order alligator certainly would not allow it. Although Bai Zemin had managed to kill Xian Kuan and was now only one opponent away from evolving to the 2nd Order and finally acquiring his blood mystic class, he was not satisfied at all. Bai Zemin coldly looked to his right, and right there he saw Tao Xi's body, slowly materializing. Unexpected. Too unexpected. Tao Xi seemed to have lost his sanity a bit as he stared wide-eyed at his missing left leg and half of his severed tail. Even with Blink being an automatic life-saving skill, I still suffered so much damage. Tao Xi looked at Bai Zemin with wide eyes and said in a low voice, as expected from the canons of the city of His Majesty the Forgotten King. Even angels and demons would fall before its power, not to mention a mortal like me. Tao Xi extended his hand outward, and from the distance, a small object suddenly released a faint glow, before flying towards him. Bai Zemin immediately realized that it was a small wooden pagoda. It was definitely the pagoda that was in Xian Kuan's possession before. This pagoda, it belonged to His Majesty, the Forgotten King. He began to talk to himself. But after His Majesty fell after those events happened, I took the pagoda and immersed myself in deep sleep in a safe place. The immortal ice coffin can protect the soul and physical body from the passage of time without letting the records of a living being weaken over the years, but in return, you can't leave unless someone removes the top of the coffin. And the person who opens the coffin can ask for a will from the being resting inside. Bai Zemin did not interrupt or try to attack right away. He didn't care about Tao Xi's story, but what he cared about was using overlap regeneration to the max to increase his health stat and recover a little faster from his injuries, serious injuries that he had been unable to escape from earlier. That stupid Xian Kuan asked for my help to become the next king of the seas, so I did everything I could to help him. I even lent him the pagoda of corruption. Tao Xi looked at Bai Zemin, and his eyes finally showed a terrifying glare as he said almost in a whisper, "It was you. You messed it all up." Rumble. The mana inside Tao Xi's body suddenly began to boil furiously, and the sea began to rumble viciously as his magical power made its full presence known. Swoosh. 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 Hundreds and soon thousands of glowing magic circles appeared everywhere, top, bottom, left, right, center. It was as if the entire sea had been covered by magic circles in a matter of a second or two. Bai Zemin gritted his teeth and tried to think of what to do, while slowly began to become desperate. His current condition was far from good, and he had been fighting for a long time, so he could probably only use overlap regeneration for another 3 to 4 minutes at most. In addition, he also couldn't use White Hole again at his current stage, therefore, his number of cards had been drastically reduced. Gravity Manipulation, 4th Order Active Skill, Level 5, its power depends on the user's knowledge and imagination. It consumes 200 mana points to activate and 30 mana points every 5 seconds to keep active, allowing the user to increase or decrease the gravitational power of the world or part of the universe they are in at will up to a maximum of 150 times. Second activation, Ruler of All Matter. Third activation, White Hole. White holes absorb energy for a short period of time and then expel it again in the opposite direction from which it came, unlike black holes that devour everything. The magic power and soul league of the user is too low, thus you can currently only use this third activation one time every 24 hours. Effect, absorbs 70% of anything and releases it as energy. Soul Manipulation did not allow raising the level of skills that increased the knowledge of something, but Bai Zemin knew perfectly well the theory of white holes and their characteristics, therefore, he was not really receiving basic knowledge of anything. He only gained power and a terrifyingly powerful third activation. Unfortunately, although the power of the third activation of gravity manipulation was unquestionable, its limits were clear. In this case, the limit was none other than Xietain himself. Just when Xietain was contemplating what to do, since with his current situation it was absolutely impossible for him to defend against so many magical attacks, as even if 50% of them were stopped by the anti-magic domain, the other 50% was enough to devastate him given the severity of his wounds. A silhouette stood next to him. "I will fight alongside you." Xietain looked at Shangguan Bingshui, and somehow felt that she was a little different. Unfortunately, there was no time for such things. "I will do my best, little kids." Shangguan Xingyue also joined in. Wu Yijun stood next to Shangguan Bingshui, and although she said nothing and her expression was not visible due to the mask everyone wore, her resolve and intention were more than obvious. There was not much they could do anyway. They could only fight with what they had. 5,000. 10.000. 15.000. 20.000. The number of magic circles did not stop growing, and although the trio knew it was better to attack rather than let the number increase, sometimes it was difficult to do what was the best, as the circumstances were often even more of an obstacle than the obstacle itself. Just at that moment, a small disturbance in the area occurred a few hundred meters ahead. Tao Ji, who had directly consumed 70% of his remaining mana to launch a fatal attack, was surprised and his eyes widened in shock as a beautiful figure with blonde hair tied in a ponytail appeared inches in front of him. Instinctively, Tao Ji activated his strongest barrier to defend his body. But his pupils contracted fiercely when he realized that the female in front of him had played it cool. He could not activate his barrier less than half a meter away from his body, and the woman whom he had overlooked and whose existence he had forgotten since she had not participated in the entire battle was less than 5 centimeters away. Evangeline's emerald eyes flashed coldly under her mask, and at the same time as a strange energy covered her body she said in a low voice, "Distortion dance." Under the wide eyes of Tao Ji, Xietain, the Shangguan surnamed mother-daughter duo, and Wu Yijun, around 30,000 Evangelines suddenly appeared all around the sea, one for each magic circle. It all happened too fast, fast enough that the brain and nerves in Tao Ji's body could not move before the female in front of him did a 360-degree turn, and soon enough all he felt was an overwhelming flood of pain. "Bitch!" Tao Ji's bellow was not unlike a roar, and from inside his mouth came a huge fireball which Evangeline had to dodge by making use of one of her life-saving skills. Boom! The fire, drowned and suppressed by the water, did not go out but exploded, sending Tao Ji flying with injuries now more severe than before. He writhed in pain in the water as large amounts of blood spurted from the sockets where his eyes had previously been. Not only had Evangeline slashed Tao Ji's eyes, depriving him of the privilege of seeing, she had even somehow made all the magic circles disappear without a trace. Tao Ji had literally just lost 70% of the mana he had left to gain anything because of Evangeline. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 994, The Last Records. When Evangeline stood next to Xietain and the rest, both of her hands were trembling and there was a continuous trail of blood coming from her left shoulder. Xietain didn't even have a chance to ask questions when she said in a low voice, "I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize." Xietain sighed, understanding that the plan had failed. He looked at Tao Ji, whose aura had suddenly begun to rise abruptly, and said in a voice filled with regret, "The one who needs to apologize, there is me. It is probable that none of you will get out of here alive because of me." Xietan's plan was simple, but at the same time easy to accomplish. There was only one possible obstacle, and apparently Lady Luck was not with them today. He, with the help of other members of his faction, had searched for third-order soul evolvers throughout Inner Mongolia and a small part of China without success. This was completely normal, considering that the human-led Transcendent faction was the ruler of the country, so of course there weren't many third-order enemies, and those that were alive certainly wouldn't be seen so easily. Going to hunt in Russia was absolute nonsense. Where would Xietain go to hunt Russians? He didn't even know where the enemy bases were, and Russia was one of the largest countries in the world even before the planet expanded. He could as well run for months without finding anything but unclassified, first-order, or second-order enemies. But he preferred to leave that task to those who had little analytical ability and couldn't reason on something as simple as that. Therefore, only the sea was a valid option within the time limit. Bai Zemin wanted to lure some Sea City guards by causing a ruckus, luring some third-order power under the power of some prince or princess and then killing them. He could do so without worrying about anything since in the eyes of others he was part of the faction led by Xian Meier. But there was a big obstacle, the king of the East Sea. If Xian Meier's father intervened and decided to order his troops not to move or take part in the war that was going on outside the city a few kilometers above, then there was little to do unless Bai Zemin himself showed up there, which was impossible since he needed to stop Tao Ji. Really, I should have killed one of the 7th princess bodyguards after all. Bai Zemin expressed regret. Frustrating. Extremely frustrating. And extremely furious. Bai Zemin was frustrated by his powerlessness and furious with himself for his own weakness. He was frustrated because he knew the chances of winning were slim, which meant he was about to lose. He was furious that people who were important to him could die right before his eyes without him being able to do anything to prevent it. The safety of your loved ones has been threatened in front of you. The first level of your skill, Blood Berserker's Wrath, has been triggered. All the body's pain receptors have been turned off. Strength, plus 400 and agility, plus 400. The side effect of the first level, loss of rationality equal to 10%, is weakened by the effect of your tidal brilliant mind, by 10%. The rationality loss is weakened by half thanks to the passive effect of your unique skill of 4th order Immovable Heart. The path you walk has been challenged. The second level of your Blood Berserker's Wrath skill has been triggered. Merging benefits of the 2 activated levels. Strength plus 1000, agility plus 1000, magic plus 1000, stamina plus 1000, health plus 1000. For the next 120 seconds, the cooldown times of all your skills will reset to 0 immediately. The side effect of the second level, loss of rationality equivalent to 15%, is weakened by the effect of your tidal brilliant mind, by 10%. The rationality loss is weakened by half thanks to the passive effect of your unique skill of 4th order Immovable Heart. Despite the huge power boost he had just received, it was still not enough. He needed the 3rd trigger added to the 2 already active, only then would he be able to overcome the severity of his wounds. Even if he no longer felt pain and could now move freely at the cost of rapidly worsening his condition even more, the fact that he couldn't even draw 70% of his full strength even before the 1st and 2nd triggers fired was his cruel reality. I don't care about anything anymore. You all will be buried here and now. Tao Ji roared. Everything in his surroundings suddenly began to glow brightly to the point where his silhouette was barely visible and his aura exploded towards the sky along with his voice. Soul Corruption. Soul Corruption was a skill learned by Tao Ji after more than 4,000 years of study. This skill allowed him to recover 100% of his mana and multiply his magical power and magic stat by 2 for 60 minutes at the cost of losing his life. If Tao Ji was in his right mind, he may not have activated Soul Corruption, but after suffering consecutive defeats at the hands of soul evolvers weaker than him, something finally broke inside him. Let's give everything we have. Not everything is lost, and this could be our last race. Bai Zemin took a deep breath and tightened his grip on annihilation of the falling sky. I'll go first. Boom. He didn't wait for anyone's response and immediately dashed towards his enemy. The flesh and muscles of his arms were torn to pieces, but Bai Zemin had surrendered to using blood manipulation to stop the bleeding and improve his condition. The improvement would be negligible in a short period of time, and time was precisely what he lacked. Legs, arms, torso, and even from his face and neck, Bai Zemin's skin began to explode and the water to turn red. Feeling no pain, he continued. Shangguan Bingshui followed him a few meters behind, Evangeline vanished, and Shangguan Xinyue together with Wu Yijuan began to do their best to provide support. Rumble. The battle went on for another 4 to 5 minutes, and although this amount of time was not long, the danger of each second was colossal considering that all of them could attack at least 100 to 300 times per second. Wu Yijuan was the first to be out of the battle after consuming all her mana. Shangguan Xinyue tried her best, but her skills were not meant to be used under the sea. She was seriously injured after being hit by more than a dozen of Tao Ji's magical attacks and lost consciousness not long after. Her fate was unknown. Evangeline had managed to pierce Tao Ji's heart after Bai Zemin destroyed her thoracic cavity thanks to Shangguan Bingshui and her charm, but the cost to pay was a large wound in her abdomen that left her mortally wounded and knocked out on the spot. Unfortunately, neither Shangguan Xingyue nor Evangeline was particularly close to Bai Zemin. The third trigger was never triggered. Shangguan Bingshui was gasping for air. Her two arms hung on either side of her body, and although she had suffered several bloody wounds, none of them were fatal. The problem was that she didn't have a skill like overlap regeneration to replenish her mana dozens of times, and after spending all her mana and using mana drive from the rank 4 earring Bai Zemin had gifted her, she finally ran out of fuel. Broken arms and no mana. No more melee combat and no more magic. Her beautiful blue eyes were bloodshot as she looked at the scene in front of her, and although her beautiful face was distorted by hatred, the tears falling uncontrollably gave her an extremely fragile and pitiful appearance. Never in my life did I think I could hate someone this much. Not for a first-order soul evolver. Tao Ji hissed through his teeth. His magic staff hovered at his side, and he was currently using his one hand to cling tightly to the neck of the being he hated most in the entire cosmos. He had come to hate this human so strongly in such a short time that it was hard to believe. Bai Zemin felt no pain, and with his half-consciousness dulled, he could barely feel the sharp claws of his enemy digging into his neck. His left arm was nowhere to be seen, and the same applied to his left leg. Both limbs had exploded in bloody mist after failing to break 2 lightning snakes launched by Tao Ji. His eyes were barely open, and the only thing keeping him awake was the fact that he knew that if he closed his eyes, it would mean the true end not only for him but for those with him. If I had only chosen an easier class. If I hadn't been greedy, I wouldn't have had to face such absurd requirements to evolve. A special second-order class would have been more than enough for me to be able to kill this bastard. Although Bai Zemin's consciousness was semi-dulled, his thoughts were clearer than ever. He thought of his family, sister, mother, father. They would surely be sad. What was to become of Meng Qi? She was waiting for him in the royal city of the Sikh kingdom together with Xian Meier. He thought of Shangguan Bingshui, and admitted that if it weren't for Lilith's existence, he would consider her as a possible life partner now that her feelings for him seemed to be at least a little more than mere friendship. He thought of Wu Yijuan. She was an excellent woman in every possible way, but somehow he just couldn't accept her feelings for different reasons. Bai Zemin felt that he had been a little unfair, and he hoped that he would ever be able to repay her, if there was a next life at least. Bai Zemin also thought of Feng Tianwu. He felt some regret since she would probably die soon. Would it have changed anything if he had not made that request to her more than half a month ago? Bai Zemin did not know, and still did not understand why she did what she did. How many seconds had it been since Tao Ji had captured him? Probably no more than 10. But those seconds were like an eternity for Bai Zemin. At some point, and as Tao Ji continued to inflict wounds on his broken body, Bai Zemin's thoughts shifted to Lilith. It was a pity. He had finally found true love and was one big step closer to fulfilling his greatest dream of all, but now everything seemed so distant and impossible to achieve. Bai Zemin apologized in his heart, as he wasn't going to be able to return the favor for everything she had done for him ever since day one of the apocalypse. He believed that she would forgive him for not keeping his promise, but surely she would not forgive him for dying. Bai Zemin hoped that Lilith could move on in her own way, as he knew that she had lost too much in her life and hoped that losing him would not become the cause of her fall. Finally, Bai Zemin thought of his daughter. Although she was not conceived by normal methods, daughter after all, since a small part of her soul was composed of records born from him. He really was a terrible father. His daughter had barely been born and needed the paternal warmth that only he could offer her, but a month or 2 later she was left behind while he went to another world. Even if Bai Zemin had no options back then, the reality was undeniable. After 6 long months, he had returned to Bai Shirling's side, but only 3 months later he was about to leave her again, and probably permanently. Really, what a bad father he was. But Bai Shirlin was powerful and talented, plus, she was very young, so maybe she could get over it easier than the adults who had a greater understanding of what death represented. Bai Shirlin. Shirlin. Sure. Lin. It was then that by pure coincidence or things of fate, Bai Zemin's thoughts moved to the object Kong Jun had given him before diving into deep water. Although Bai Zemin's memory was a bit dull given his current bad condition, he could remember Kong Jun telling him that the item was something he would be needing today, in the words of the former queen of the Weaver Ants. But how was a soul stone supposed to help him with his current situation? Unless a new golden spear appeared out of nowhere and killed Tao Ji, there was no way to get out of this alive. But even then, Xietain had nothing to lose. He felt a little grateful to Tao Ji, who while causing more and more holes in his body had at least left his right arm for him to connect with his spatial storage ring on the index finger of his right hand. A faint and almost indistinguishable purple flash shone on the bottom of the sea, and a second later a small cracked stone appeared on Xietan's right hand. It was the same cracked, third-order soul stone from before. Cracked. Xietain had never seen a cracked soul stone before. Out of pure natural instinct, he sent some of his mana through that crack. Still struggling? Ha 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 ha. Fight more. The more you fight the more satisfied I will be. Tao Ji conjured a water spear and with a thought pierced Xietan's stomach, I have 54 minutes left to live and I will make sure to unleash all my hatred on you for at least 50 before finally killing them all. Xietain was not listening to him. Not only because he could no longer hear anything because even if he could he certainly wouldn't pay attention to Tao Ji's words. This was because he finally understood something while learning a big secret. Xietain did not know if it was a figment of his imagination, but, for an instant, he saw himself back in the command room of the Sky Destroyer, back to that fateful day when he and she met for the first and last time. He didn't know if it was his imagination or not but, somehow, Xietain could once again see that milk-white, naked, exotic beauty with long, silky smooth black hair tantalizingly covering part of her feminine charms. It was as if he could see that enchanting mysterious smile as she looked at him with her completely black eyes and said for the second time, I have decided to bet everything, until the last of my records on you, and I believe you will not disappoint me. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 995 Second Order, Xietain and First Meeting. By injecting large amounts of mana, the small crack in the soul stone simply grew a little, but it still needed some time to break completely. And Xietain was clearer than anyone else that time was exactly what he lacked. Therefore, he could only make use of a resource he had been saving, reserving, and had been unwilling to use or spend for fear of not being able to recover it, rather, for fear that recovering it would be extremely difficult if it was even possible. For the first time, Xietain focused on that stat with a solitary, embarrassing point in the face of the rest of his other main stats. However, to his surprise, what Xietain faced when using that single point of spiritual power was not only the total absorption of the records inside the soul stone, but he also discovered something that would definitely open a big door for him in the not-so-near future. There were many things from his conversation with the former queen of the Weaver Ants that Xietain had simply overlooked or had not given them that much importance at the time. However, it was only now that he finally understood how mysterious, powerful, and brilliant Xietain was. The former Queen Xietain had 100 years to live, but when she used her skill to see Xietan's future she lost those 100 years leaving her with barely a few minutes. What did this mean? The answer was very simple. From the most natural logical sense, Xietain was the cause of Xietan's death. He had killed her even if he had not used force or had not intended to. No, he had not killed her. He had not dealt the final blow. Therefore, what the former Queen Xietain did was simple. She stored her records inside a third-order soul stone with methods known only to her race in the same way she had passed most of her records to Xietain to nurture her as the supreme queen of the Weaver Ants. Once the soul stone was shattered, Xietan's death would be fully confirmed, and Xietain, who had critically injured her in the past by taking 99.99% of her lifetime and now shattered the soul stone where the former queen's remaining records rested, was naturally going to obtain what quintessentially belonged to the victor of a battle of records. Will Xietain get much? Probably not, considering that the vast majority of the former queen's records were bestowed by her to the egg from which Xietain was born. But, he didn't need much. All Xietain needed was the record of him killing a third-order being by himself. That was more than enough, everything else was minor benefits in comparison. In a world where there was no life. In this world, the air was incredibly heavy, and even breathing would become a laborious task for any living being, if there were any inhabiting it. The gravity of this planet was sickeningly powerful, so powerful that a first-order soul evolver would die immediately just by standing there doing nothing. The whole world smelled of iron, and the visibility was very bad because of the thick fog that covered the whole earth. However, this fog was not a normal fog of the kind that formed on cold days, and its coppery color was proof of this. The fog was actually old blood that had been condensing in the world for a long time, and part of the reason behind the iron smell that stank up the whole globe was exactly this reddish-colored fog. The land was arid, as if a great drought on a global scale had punished this planet for years after years without mercy. However, if one were to look carefully through some of the small cracks that covered the world like patches trying to cover up something troubling or scary, they would immediately notice that the ground was stained red. It was dried blood, dried over a long period of time. On top of a mountain over 700 meters high. Sitting on a seemingly normal rock about 30 to 40 centimeters high, a lone man stared into the distance with his eyes as red as those of a legendary demon portrayed in picture books staring into nothingness. There were no trees to look at, and there were no passages to appreciate. This man had been sitting in that same position with only minor changes for at least 10 years, with his movements being more abrupt recently during the last year and a few months in particular. Just then, the man seemed to feel something and raised his head for a few seconds before looking down again. His eyes stared at the small and practically unnoticed green sprout that seemed to be starting to grow in the middle of one of the cracks, and although it was just a small grass that many would definitely ignore or step on, in this man's eyes it was very significant. Maybe it was because this might be the only sign of life left in this world. Maybe it was because that sprout had been keeping him company. Or maybe it was because that little sprout gave him hope that things would soon be different. The man slowly stood up with somewhat stiff movements, and his bones boomed like thunder exploding in the clouds. At the same time, something deep in the man's soul suddenly began to release a brilliant crimson radiance, and in a matter of seconds, the radiance had become so powerful that the man's upper body began to glow, and this was noticeable even with the heavy plate armor he wore. He remained standing as he looked forward with a serene expression on his face, but in contrast to before, this time he really seemed to be waiting for something, as the slight expectation that shone in his eyes with each blink was impossible to miss, considering his eyes hadn't shone in a long time. You have received records of 3rd Order Sherlin level 200. Congratulations, all the evolution requirements have been fulfilled to perfection within the set time limit. Analyzing records obtained during the class evolution period. All records have been successfully analyzed. As Tao Xi tortured by Zeman by not only inflicting constant wounds on his body, but also saying hurtful and humiliating things, his expression suddenly changed for the worse, as even though his eyes had been torn apart by Evangeline, it did not obstruct his ability to sense the changes of everything around him at all. Feeling the aura of the young enemy he hated more than anyone else in the universe rise abruptly until it soon reached a level of considerable danger, Tao Xi roared in preparation to end with Bai Zeman's life the very next second. Unfortunately, Tao Xi's opportunity disappeared the moment he decided not to finish off Bai Zeman, when he had the chance to do it all for the sake of satisfying his desire for revenge. As to what price Tao Xi would have to pay for this, he would soon find out without a doubt. Boom! A large explosion suddenly sent Tao Xi flying backwards, and the waters of the sea churned fiercely, causing Shangguan Bingshui to retreat under her reluctantly as well, since Wu Yijun had no mana to activate hydrokinesis. However, she and Wu Yijun let out cries of horror and panic when they saw Bai Zeman's body exploding without warning. Everything about him disappeared, his flesh exploded in such a way that it turned to blood, joining the blood coursing through his veins and painting a small part of the sea crimson red. No. No. Wu Yijun shook her head slightly at the same time as her whole body trembled uncontrollably. She seemed to be on the verge of mental and spiritual collapse as she stared at the place where the one she loved had just disappeared after exploding. Shangguan Bingshui's face was pale as a ghost as she watched the red blood slowly spreading and dissolving. It wouldn't be long before everything of what once conformed Bai Zeman as existence would disappear, and the very thought of it made her feel as if she was going crazy. Just at that moment, Shangguan Bingshui saw a small red flash, something similar to a cube-shaped stone that soon began to release a brighter and brighter glow, illuminating part of the sea with its radiance. What is that? Shangguan Bingshui whispered to herself in a voice somewhat hoarse from the tears choking her. Under her and her good sister's disbelieving eyes, all the blood mist that Bai Zeman had exploded into began to recoil, and at surprisingly high speeds his body began to reshape itself. However, not even a second after his body reappeared, before the eyes of both women, it exploded again. Boom! This time, both Shangguan Bingshui and Wu Yijun watched as that small cubic stone glowed brighter and brighter as Bai Zeman's body reformed and then exploded for the 3rd time. 4 times. 5 times. 6 times. 7 times. Bai Zeman's body exploded over and over again, but as strange as it seemed, he could still see the whole process as if he was in spiritual form appreciating how his body was reforming. Congratulations, you have successfully advanced to second order. You have received unique class, Blood Mystic. Your physical body is too weak to support the record stored in your soul during the advancement process. To evolve and survive, both body and soul needed to be within a certain level of balance between the two. If the soul was too powerful in comparison to the body, what would happen would be very similar to what would happen if a person put a light bulb in a power generator meant to abruptly power a construction machine. Therefore, Xietan's physical body needed to be rebuilt in order to adapt to the power his soul would have once he absorbed at least part of the records gained during the period he was stuck at level 50. In addition to feeling grateful for the fact that his body's pain sensors had been turned off after the activation of the skill Blood Berserker's Wrath, as feeling his body explode and regenerate repeatedly was certainly not something Xietain wanted to feel, his greatest gratitude was directed towards the former Queen Shirlin. Shirlin's first mother. She had certainly played a big role in Xietan's life, even though they had only known each other for less than an hour. His meeting with her on the Sky Destroyer had been one of the biggest turning points in his life, even surpassing that moment when Xietain managed to kill the mutant beetle back at the university during the early days of evolution. As Xietain watched everything happening from what seemed to be some sort of astral form, his consciousness suddenly began to be pulled towards the small red cube-shaped stone. He didn't even have time to think over things too much. In less than a second, Xietain found himself on top of a mountain in an unknown location. Before Xietain could look at his surroundings, a hoarse voice similar to someone who hadn't said a word for a long time sounded behind him. Blood Mystic, Xietain hurriedly turned around, and when he saw the man in front of him, he was surprised not by the fact that this man was by a considerable margin the most perfect in terms of physical appearance, but by the not-so-slight resemblance he had with himself. In addition to being better looking in general, the man before Xietain had red eyes and an ice-cold expression on his face. The most notable feature would be that, unlike Xietain, this man had blood-red hair falling down his back and swaying gently despite the strong winds blowing at the top of the mountain. Who are you? Xietain frowned as he looked at the small cube-shaped stone floating in front of the unknown man. The man said nothing, and for what seemed like minutes simply stared at Xietain with seemingly curious eyes. Xietain glanced sideways to the corner, and what caught his eye was the heavy-looking two-handed sword stuck in the ground. The sword looked quite old but still magnificent, and what made his eyes tremble was that attached to the hilt of the weapon was something that Xietain easily identified as the modified sinew of a mutant beast. Our next meeting. I look forward to it. Xietain looked at the man slowly sitting on the rock behind him. Xietain wanted to open his mouth to say something but couldn't, as he soon began to feel a great pulling force dragging him somewhere. However, he could still faintly see the man and hear his voice. The next time we meet it won't be this friendly. Keep that in mind, and grow up strong. Blood Mystic doesn't seem to be much. In the next instant, Xietain disappeared and the man with long red hair stared at the empty space in front of him with an indifferent expression. He was alone, once again. However, the man was fine with that. He wouldn't be alone much longer, and at this rate, he would soon be able to fulfill his dream. You and I are destined to be enemies even though it shouldn't be that way. If there is anyone to blame, it would be you for being the lucky chosen one able to have everything while I am nothing but the black sheep that fate chose to punish on a whim. Fate or not, he was going to crush it all. No matter who or what, everything that came his way was going to be destroyed. That was the way it had been so far, and that was the way it was going to be in the future. The man looked at the small cube-shaped stone in front of him, and when the small stone stopped glowing, the incomplete part that was previously covered by the light became visible. You and I are destined to be enemies because the existence of the two of us is not allowed. With that person or without, it's just a matter of time. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 996 Race Evolution and Blood Mystic. Tao Ji, Shangguan, Bing Shui, and Wu Yijuan. The three of them stared as Xietan's body continuously reformed over and over again, only to explode again less than a second later. It was as if a video was being played on an endless loop of fast-forwarding and reverse. However, there was one thing that was clear to all three of them after the first 20 or 30 seconds, and it was the fact that Xietain was definitely not dying. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Exploding into hundreds of millions of tiny fragments certainly had to hurt, not to mention a process of such magnitude repeating itself dozens of times. However, regardless of all the pain Xietain might be experiencing, the reality was that his aura had not stopped growing during this entire terrifying and tyrannical process. Bastard! Tao Xi roared, and the entire sea over 3 kilometers around him shook with vigor. His aura broke out completely as he shouted with his head looking up to the heavens, "Soul record, whatever you are, I curse you 1,000,000,000 times." Tao Xi had never felt so many complicated emotions at the same time, let alone because of a first-order soul evolver. But how could he not feel anger, fear, frustration, shame, and desire for revenge? How could he be at peace knowing he had less than 50 minutes to live? Such a thing was impossible. Tao Xi could sense that his hated enemy had entered the second order, and given his severe injuries, his chances of killing him were not particularly high even if the young human was also not in good condition and was in fact worse off than he was. Xietain was capable of causing all these injuries to Tao Xi while he was still at level 50. It didn't require too much thought or a genius to know the obvious. To flee? No. The thought of running away never crossed Tao Xi's mind. What was the point of running away if he was going to die one way or another anyway? Since he was going to die regardless of whether he was killed or not, then he might as well do everything he could to make the impertinent young man in front of him live with regrets for the rest of his miserable life and thus make him wish for death. You all. You really get on my nerves. Tao Xi's roar of anger, despair, and frustration would have easily raised waves of great magnitude were it not for the fact that he was currently almost 4,000 meters deep in the sea. However, even with the pressure of the water and the gravity of the world, his voice resounded in the depths under the drive of his high magical power. Wu Yijun was out of mana and was currently trying to recover as fast as possible without being able to drink mana recovery potions, but when Tao Xi's roar hit her with sonic strength, her mind went blank and she staggered. Shangguan Bingshui quickly moved to try to help her when she saw blood starting to gush out of Wu Yijun's ears, and when she managed to hold her up using her teeth and clinging to her magic robe, Shangguan Bingshui couldn't help but wince in pain. The sudden movement had caused both of her arms to move all over the place, making her feel all her pulverized bones moving past skin and flesh. Die. Tao Xi stepped back making use of his only leg as he took back his magical staff and waved it outward, freeze lightning lash. Despite his fatal wounds, magical attacks did not require a good physical condition to launch as was the case with physical attacks. As long as one had enough mana and high magical power, they could unleash any magic that their consciousness allowed them to activate. Seeing the ice whip with bright flashes of lightning slashing towards them, Shangguan Bingshui abruptly turned around with her back facing the oncoming attack and shielding Wu Yijun's body. Shangguan Bingshui had no mana to use any skills, nor could she use her sword to defend against it, and although her agility gave her a 60% chance of dodging Tao Xi's magical attack, the same could not be said with Wu Yijun needing protection. By the time Wu Yijun realized this fact, it was already too late. Fortunately, the worst did not happen because, at the same time as Tao Xi's magical attack approached, both Shangguan Bingshui and Wu Yijun were enveloped and surrounded by a strange force that despite weakening them gave them incomparable feelings of security and trust. Bang! Like an eggshell hitting a wall, Tao Xi's magical attack broke apart ridiculously and without causing the slightest damage when the strange energy surrounding both women came in contact with it. I curse you. I curse you. I curse all of you. Tao Xi did not give up and as his roar spread under the sea, he launched several magical assaults more. However, even after launching 10 attacks, they all ended up exploding and turning into tiny particles of light before finally becoming nothing. With Xietan's strength stat growing exponentially, the range of the anti-magic domain increased as well, now covering an area of approximately 500 meters in total with him as its core. Furthermore, he was now a second-order soul evolver, so the magical attacks of a fourth-order existence, like Tao Xi, had a 75% probability of being completely nullified. While it was true that Xietain and the two women had been lucky that the other 25% didn't show up, they had been unlucky enough today. Now that they were having a bit of fortune on their side, they certainly wouldn't complain. At that precise moment and before Tao Xi could continue his assault, even before the former leader of the Legion of Mages of the former kingdom under what was now known as the East Sea could think of changing his targets to the two unconscious women floating in the distance. An explosion louder than the previous one shook the water vigorously as Xietan's body exploded again. A flash of golden light shone for an instant, and when the only three beings able to remain standing and awake on the battlefield looked forward, they all noticed Xietain. Bai Zemin was standing in front of Shangguan Bingshui and Wu Yijun with his back facing them while looking at Tao Xi with an indifferent expression. Wu Yijun looked at Bai Zemin's body, and seeing that both his left leg and left arm were missing, she couldn't help but feel her heart ache. You okay?" she asked, practically in a whisper. "I won't die. None of us will. Not now. Not this time. Not today." Bai Zemin didn't lie saying he was fine, but at least he didn't say discouraging words either. "I see." Wu Yijun whispered before nodding weakly, "I believe in you." Then, she looked at her friend and rephrased her words, "We believe in you." Shangguan Bingshui did not say anything, she did not even nod, but stared at Bai Zemin's back as if she wanted to engrave his form deep in her memories. In less than an hour, she thought she would never again see that back that she had inadvertently started to follow, not because of competitiveness, but because she did not want to be left behind. If she had doubts before this, Shangguan Bingshui no longer had any doubt about the fact that she definitely liked Bai Zemin. She liked him not only as a friend, but also as a man. As for where this would lead, Shangguan Bingshui didn't know what she wanted to do with these feelings, but she certainly didn't want it to end like this. Regardless of what Shangguan Bingshui and Wu Yijun might be feeling, Bai Zemin looked at Tao Xi and couldn't help but sigh at how much of a difference there was now. "You and I are both seriously injured. Actually, my condition is even worse than yours." Bai Zemin stretched out his right hand, and this simple movement caused several of his muscles to tear as if to prove his words. "But now that I reached the second order, you cannot defeat anymore." Bai Zemin's physical body had become far more powerful than before, so much so that the difference between his self from a minute ago and his current self was simply too massive to explain with numbers. Even so, his serious injuries were still serious, except that he was now healing a lot faster, thanks to the terrifying health boost along with overlap regeneration. In fact, Bai Zemin could have close to or even over 10,000 health points if he used overlap regeneration. This meant that the current him could recover at least 10 times faster than before. "I can't defeat?" Tao Xi trembled not out of fear, but out of anger. He laughed softly and said slowly, "And what makes you think so? I still have a lot of mana to use, and I don't think I need to lecture you on whether my magical power is capable of damaging you or not." Bai Zemin looked at Tao Xi, but his mind was elsewhere. He secretly wondered if what he had seen before was just an illusion or not. But on second thought, Bai Zemin remembered having a dream with an atmosphere very similar to that. Probably just a lucid dream, he said to himself, before dismissing what had just happened. At the end of the day, he had been at the bottom of the sea all this time with Shangguan Bingshui and Wu Yijun as witnesses of this fact. "Well, regarding your question." Bai Zemin looked at the blood on his body, and it wasn't hard for him, who was aware of the change, to notice the small golden tint almost undetectable amidst the deep red. "You have leveled up and reached level 100. You have received 200 status points to distribute freely. Your second order class, Blood Mystic, raises your race by 1 league. Congratulations, now that your race has been raised by 1 league, your strength, agility, health, stamina, mana, and magic increase by plus 1,000 natural points each. Your level has reached the peak of the second order, and therefore part of the records gained during the evolution process could not be absorbed and will be added to your soul once you select your third order class and successfully evolve to the next power league. With the league of your race going up by 1 and the improvement of your physical body, your passive skill first order superhuman health level 5 has been raised to the next order in a natural way. With the league of your race going up by 1 and the improvement of your physical body, your passive skill third order golden bones level 1 has been raised to level 5 in a natural way. Your passive skill first order enhanced dexterity level 5 has evolved to the next order in a natural way. By absorbing the records of a being with the skill clairvoyance, you have learned more about the mystique of seeing events before they happen, which grants you the privilege of being a friend of time. Your passive skill unranked danger sense level 5 has evolved to the next order. Congratulations, by becoming Blood Mystic, your third order blood manipulation level 5 skill is leveled directly to the max level of the fourth order. There were several records that needed to be checked, but given the circumstances it was impossible for Bai Zemin to do it right now. However, there was one thing that was certain. My advancement to second order is not just a matter of stats, Tao Xi. Bai Zemin said softly. His eyes filled with exhaustion flashed for a second as he slowly said, I'll show you, this new power I obtained. More specifically, a pretty scary skill. As Xietain said, his breakthrough was not merely about statistics. Although he was not yet aware of all the records he had gained and would only be able to check them once things calmed down a bit, there was something Xietain knew. And it was the fact that his current self was disgustingly strong. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 997 End of the Battle. I refuse to believe that my attacks can't reach you. Tao Xi muttered before roaring from deep within his soul, I refuse. Swoosh. 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 As Xietain looked indifferently and exhaustedly at the hundreds of glowing magic circles that appeared around him and illuminated a good portion of the sea, Tao Xi waved his magic staff and shouted in a hoarse voice, Jinx of water. The magic circles released a great flood of magical power, and soon the mana in the waters got disturbed. Bubbles of hot gas began to emanate from the depths and ascend, but some of them exploded on the way, causing explosions triggered by the appearance of hot gas in a place where it shouldn't be. Boom. 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 Despite being just seemingly harmless bubbles, each blast of opposing forces resulted in large quakes below sea level. Even on the surface changes rose as dozens of waves large enough to wipe out the coast of a city easily soared skyward as if they wanted to touch the clouds themselves. However, it was not all. Each time a bubble of hot gas exploded, the heat released evaporated large amounts of water at the same time until soon a small emptiness began to take place on the battlefield. That emptiness quickly filled with highly toxic gas, and with so much water in the surrounding area acting as walls, there was no place to run away from it. This was an attack that Xietain could not nullify with his anti-magic domain. The power behind each explosion and the toxic gas certainly contained some magic in them, but even if that magic disappeared upon contact with the anti-magic domain, they would not be completely nullified. However, Xietain did not panic. His current self was not the same Xietain from 60 seconds ago. Taking advantage of the empty space that had formed in the sea, Xietain waved his right hand and the storage pearl flew out from inside his spatial storage ring. A great torrent of blood shot out from the crimson pearl, and before Shangguan Bing Shui and Wu Yijuan realized it, they were both enveloped by a red-colored sphere with golden veins. When the toxic gas came in contact with the blood, instead of sizzling, what happened was that the golden veins of the sphere glowed, and soon all the gas was absorbed. The power of the sphere increased a little, and with that, it held easily steady withstanding the shock waves of each explosion without hurting the two people inside. At the same time, 3 thick, long blood chains shot out from the back of the blood sphere, disappearing into deep water in a matter of blinks, with only the part that attached them to the blood sphere visible. Tao Xi could not see, but he could definitely tell what was happening. Xietain breathed in deeply, and as if in his lungs there was a black hole, all the toxic gas began to fly towards him and was absorbed by his breath. At the same time, several shockwaves hit him, but his body barely moved. Impossible. How can you still be on your feet? Xietain exhaled heavily, and inwardly, he felt his blood absorbing the toxins from the poisonous gas. It wasn't hard for him to notice how his flesh and broken muscles were now beginning to heal faster than before. It was then that he finally accepted the fact that he was no longer a normal human. In fact, his race was not exactly human even in the status window that was the graphical representation of the records that made up his existence. Tao Xi, I think it's time to put an end to this. Xietain shook his head to shake off the dizziness and tiredness he felt. His condition was very bad, he needed to rest or else he would end up collapsing soon. You're right, it's time to put an end to this once and for all. Tao Xi roared and his aura increased again as a sign of him getting ready for a new magical attack. However, swoosh, 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 swoosh. At the same time as the sea water thunderingly returned to its place, the pale blue blood coming out of Tao Xi's wound suddenly glowed and moved as if it had abruptly come to life. Again this trick from before? It didn't work before and it won't work now. Xietain had already tried to imprison Tao Xi using blood chains. Unfortunately, Tao Xi's magical power was simply too overwhelming, so all the bindings always ended up broken in less than 2 seconds. Besides, it wasn't as if stopping a mage by binding them was really a big deal. At the end of the day, mages could still cast magic even if they were imprisoned. I was a first-order existence before, but now I am second-order peak. Bai Zemin muttered under his breath. His eyes flashed coldly as he looked at Tao Xi and said in the same tone of voice, "Before, blood manipulation was a third-order skill, but now it is a fourth-order skill." Bai Zemin's body glowed and soon his figure was enveloped by that familiar halo of golden light that always made him feel so warm. His hair seemed to be tinged with gold amidst the glow, and even his blood-red eyes seemed to be tinged slightly golden in the process of activating overlap regeneration. Tao Xi attempted to activate several magical skills at the same time, and indeed he succeeded. However, his expression changed abruptly as the runes that were beginning to light up on his soul suddenly began to gradually fade more and more until they became completely dull. "What, don't mess with me?" Bai Zemin's expression was ice-cold as he watched from a distance, while Tao Xi failed time and time again in his attempts to throw magic. Magic circles were appearing all over the area, but none of those magic circles reached their maximum brightness before the skill cast. Bang! 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 Like glass bottles crashing to the ground from great heights, tens and soon hundreds of magic circles exploded and turned into tiny particles of bright light that soon disappeared in the form of mana feeding the waters of the sea. "It won't work, no matter how hard you try." Bai Zemin shook his head and deactivated his anti-magic domain, which was starting to become a heavy weight on his badly wounded body and exhausted spirit. Tao Xi seemed more confident as he felt the anti-magic domain disappear, but the results were the same no matter how hard he tried. Bai Zemin used the waters to his advantage to slowly advance towards his enemy, and when his eyes landed on the four thick blood chains with golden lines coiled around Tao Xi's body, he couldn't help but have his pupils light up slightly. "What's with these chains? They're sucking all my mana and that of my skills." Tao Xi finally began to feel genuine despair. As a mage, his magical power and the mana that acted as fuel to power it were everything. Even if Tao Xi lost his limbs, he would still be fine as long as he could cast magic. However, now that his two most important attributes were being consumed and absorbed, Tao Xi found himself falling to the bottom of an abyss. Bai Zemin looked at the golden veins on the blood chains and sighed in his heart as he watched them slowly but surely absorb all of Tao Xi's mana. Worse yet, every time he tried to activate a magical skill, the mana he diverted for the activation of that skill was swallowed by the blood chains to become stronger and self-sustaining. What was the limit of this new automatic blood manipulation feature? Bai Zemin was not too clear, but the only reason it was working on Tao Xi in such an overwhelming way was probably due to the fact that he was severely injured and for better or worse could not draw out his full self. Sensing Bai Zemin's presence closer, Tao Xi swallowed his next words and waited in silence for what he knew would come sooner rather than later, or so he intended. "Hey, human." Tao Xi smiled fiercely and said hoarsely, "How does it feel to be so strong?" Bai Zemin did not reply. "It must be fun for you to make fun of everyone, isn't it?" Bai Zemin remained silent. Being a first-order existence, you were able to fight against an initial fourth-order soul evolver. You will probably be able to fight against a fourth-order medium or maybe peak now that you have evolved, isn't it? Silence. "Tell me, what will you do to ease the hatred you feel towards me? Torture me? Humiliate me? Tell me your plans. I want to know how you feel before I die." Tao Xi felt no fear but somehow seemed very interested in knowing more about Bai Zemin before he was killed. Unfortunately, he didn't know Bai Zemin well enough. What have you been talking about all this time?" Bai Zemin said indifferently, "You ask me what it feels like to be so strong? Not much really, I know there are beings far stronger than me. You say it must be fun for me to make fun of everyone? Apart from not having time to waste in that way, I haven't thought like that even once in my life. Feel hatred towards you? Tao Xi, you and I don't have any blood feud. I feel anger towards you because you hurt my subordinates and some people precious to me, but I don't think you are worthy of my hatred." Hatred? Tao Xi and Bai Zemin were enemies because they were standing on opposite sides. It was natural to face each other to death since fate dictated it. But hatred? Bai Zemin had only come to hate very few people in his life, and Tao Xi did not meet the requirements. Without waiting for a response from his enemy, Bai Zemin, enveloped by the halo of golden light, said indifferently, "Divine blood punishment." His words had only left his mouth, sounding a bit hollow inside the mask that allowed him to breathe, when suddenly a kind of crack opened up in the bottom of the sea and the water within several kilometers seemed to be dyed crimson, and some of the water turned into red chains that coiled around Tao Xi's already restrained body. Divine blood punishment has been activated and you are affected because your blood is inferior to the enemy's. While the effect lasts, your level falls to 200 and your league to 3rd order. At the same time as 2 messages filled Tao Xi's head as a warning of what was happening, his already weakened body became even weaker. Tao Xi was hit by a wave of exhaustion and pain that made him grunt as his head whirled. What is this? He could no longer even speak properly, and with his stats suddenly dropping by a substantial amount, the severity of his condition only worsened greatly to the point where his mind was no longer clear. Xietain reached his right hand forward and first took the wooden pagoda in Tao Xi's possession along with the magic staff. After putting these things away, he looked at his enemy for a few seconds, before extending his right hand again, but this time towards his mauled chest. Amidst the golden halo, a faint but clear blood-red glow suddenly covered Xietan's right hand and soon spread up his arm until it reached his shoulder. This was a new skill he had acquired by evolving to 2nd order and becoming a blood mystic. Xietain knew what this skill did, but he wanted to check it out, and the enemy in front of him was perfect as a first subject. Xietan's hand did not hurt Tao Xi's body, but continued to move forward, and like a small stone falling gently into a lake, it pierced further and disappeared. Ugh. Tao Xi felt a slight discomfort, but that slight discomfort soon grew, and his more primal instincts made him fight back. What are you doing? Stop. Arg. With each passing second, Tao Xi's discomfort turned to despair and fear, before finally culminating in terror after realizing what was happening. As a mage, his strength was too low to break the chains that bound him, and being unable to use magic as the blood chains were sucking up all his mana, all Tao Xi could do was writhe a little and howl in pain and fear. Approximately 5 minutes later, the shriek stopped completely and the water regained its calm. No more explosions, no more yelling, no more magic, no more terrifying physical attacks, no more movements. Just calm and silence, terrifying silence that only a place as deep as this could have. Xietain looked at the small, normal-looking, but wound-covered alligator slowly being torn apart by the weight of the water and gravity. The lifeless creature did not hold up under such pressure, and in 2 or 3 seconds it exploded into a pile of bloody pulp. Xietain lightly clenched the small bright blue pearl in his right fist and whispered to himself, no wonder. He hadn't even explored Blood Mystic's power yet, but what he had just done was enough to make his hair stand on end. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 998, Lovers with critical injuries without knowing each other's situation. Looking around, all Xietain saw was pure darkness. With no light from magic skills and Wu Yijun's seeds destroyed, the bottom of the sea was truly terrifying. It was like a wolf's mouth, there was nothing in sight but endless darkness. It was surprising that even though Xietan's race had ascended, he still couldn't see anything beyond 3 to 4 meters in front of him without mana and magic alterations. Xietain turned around and with a thought made the blood sphere that acted as a shield meant to protect Wu Yijun and Shangguan Bingshui lose its form. However, he held the 3 blood chains firm as he needed them. When Shangguan Bingshui and Wu Yijun were released, the two were shocked by the darkness in the surroundings, but soon understood that the battle was over and subconsciously the two sighed in relief, which ended up causing them great pain and making them grunt softly. Bingshui, Yijun. I'm really glad you two are well. Xietain spoke from a short distance away. I'll send you to the Collector's Pocket World so that you can recover from your wounds and refuel the mana spent during the battle. What about you? Shangguan Bingshui asked in a low voice as she tried to focus her sight to see better. I'll first look for Evangeline, Kong Jun, and your mom. It's hard to explain, but now that I evolved and obtained my Blood Mystic class, I can sense the location of my subordinates more clearly. Although I can't accurately sense Aunt Shangguan's location, I can say that she is close to Evangeline. All of them are alive. But Kong Jun needs to receive treatment soon, or he will die in less than an hour. Xietain stopped and quickly stepped back. Yijun, don't come closer. Is something wrong? Xietain heard a soft, sweet, worried, and slightly disappointed voice from no more than 3 or 4 meters in front of him. He quickly explained, not that you did anything wrong, but... Well, my treasure somehow came back to me after my body stopped exploding, but the same can't be said for my equipment so, you know. Yeah. For a second or two absolute silence returned to the depths until Xietain heard a short gasp followed by a soft grunt of pain probably brought on by the gasp and the wounds of the person in question. Are you telling me that you are completely naked now? Shangwan Bingshui could barely get those words out, making it clear that the previous gasp was her creation. Are you seriously surprised by something like that? Xietain shook his head, which earned him a new groan of pain now that his pain sensors had been reactivated with the deactivation of Blood Berserker's wrath. Well, Shangwan Bingshui didn't know what to say. She finally looked at Wu Yijun beside her and said in a low voice, I hope you're not thinking anything perverted, little Yijun. Wu Yijun jolted in surprise and embarrassment as if she had been caught doing something naughty. She was lucky as she was practically unharmed and her biggest problem was the loss of mana and stamina, or else she would have opened her wounds badly with her sudden move just now. Shangwan Bingshui shook her head, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. She felt much calmer now. Xietain was alive, her good sister was alive, Xietan's sister was alive, and she was alive. Shangwan Bingshui could not ask for more from life. Soon, the two women were sent to the collector's pocket world by Xietain, and he did not delay as he quickly headed to the bottom of the sea without approaching the city of sea creatures. When his right foot touched the bottom, Xietain immediately slashed several times with annihilation of the falling sky in the form of a one-handed sword. The sudden movements naturally did him no good, but he needed to leave a message behind. Approximately 10 minutes later, the blood chains he had sent out earlier in different directions returned, but this time they were not alone as each chain was delicately but tightly coiled around 3 unconscious bodies. Shangwan Xingyue had several small wounds, but the worst was on the top of her head and the major caused behind her loss of consciousness in the midst of the battle. Her life was out of danger since that wound had been caused by a shockwave and not by a direct attack. She only needed a few hours at most and she would open her beautiful deep blue eyes to the world again. Evangeline, on the other hand, had only 3 or 4 wounds throughout her body. The problem was that one of these wounds was on her upper chest. She was alive, but certainly needed to be treated with magic skills, or else she might die if her health stat and regeneration speed could not keep up with the rate of damage that the outsider mana was inflicting on her body. The biggest problem was undoubtedly Kong Jun. Xietain frowned as he saw that 70% to 80% of Kong Jun's exoskeletal armor was gone while the remaining 20% to 30% of it was in bad condition. The loyal guardian's flesh was visible, and although his blood was moving like a living being trying to reform the lost parts and close the wounds, it was more than obvious that the damage caused by the crimson light beam was just too much. Before leaving, Xietain picked up a silver-colored ring that he saw glowing faintly in the distance. It was most likely Taoji's property, but now it was his spoils of war. Approximately 15 minutes after Xietain entered the collector's pocket world, several silhouettes with lights around them approached from the distant point of white light where the royal city of the kingdom Xietain came from was located. A few minutes later, the figure leading them, a powerful-looking middle-aged man with deep blue hair and heavy sky-colored plate armor covering his upper body, stopped as his large gold-colored fish tail slowly swished behind his body. Xietain stood next to Meng Qi and her 2 third-order bodyguards, but she was not the only princess there. Apart from there being 4 other princesses, all of whom were beautiful and radiant with dazzling supernatural charm, a total of 6 princes with similar but different demeanors at the same time were separated from each other. Each of them was accompanied by at least 1 third-order guard, and those who had 2, as was the case with Xietain, were the most powerful and prestigious among the offspring of the royal family. Approximately 1 minute later, the Eastern Sea King snorted and his beard moved like waves in the sea at his outburst. Looks like there were 2 dead here. And judging by the fact that Xian Kuan is nowhere to be found, I bet he and that damn bodyguard of his must be the ones to lose today. The king's expression was indifferent, but his tone of voice held some anger. That stupid son of mine really put a shark in a fish tank. The reason behind the king's anger was not in the death of his son, because unlike humans, they were mutant beasts. This did not mean that mutant beasts did not have deep feelings for each other or for others, it was just that most saw the death of the weaker as natural. The strong would survive and the weak would perish. That was the one absolute law of life. However, royal father, an extremely handsome tall young man with brown hair and blue eyes, pointed out, what were those shots before? Those cannons are definitely not part of our city's defenses, are they? This young man was the first prince, his name was Xian Yuan. His level was 159 and many said that he was the most qualified to be the next East Sea King among all his brothers. There are many things you kids still have to learn. The East Sea King shook his head and said calmly, you are young and inexperienced. Our waters are not as simple as they appear to be, just like the surface has its mysteries. The cannons that bastard alligator used are only a part of the secret weapon of our kingdom, but because of him. The king gritted his teeth in fury and barely managed to restrain himself from breaking into an outburst. The princes and princesses exchanged glances with each other. They all saw astonishment in the eyes of their peers, as this was the first time they had heard anything about their kingdom's secret weapon. Indeed, there were many things they did not know despite their positions. Xietain Meier frowned slightly upon hearing her father's words. Secret weapon? She couldn't help but think about what Bai Zemin had asked her days ago, and without hesitation, she ended up agreeing to it. If that thing really existed, wouldn't she end up becoming a sinner? As for not giving up what she promised. Honestly, Xietain Meier never thought about it, but even then she wouldn't dare. All she wanted was peace, and going to war against Bai Zemin's faction for breaking a promise after they had helped not only her, but her people so much. Xietain Meier simply did not see it right. Mayor, you said that besides your human friend there were 6 others, didn't you? The East Sea King suddenly asked. That's right. Xietain Meier nodded and replied honestly, Royal Father, other than Evangeline, the human woman you chased away earlier when she tried to cause problems, there are 5 more. That human female is really powerful. If not for the fact that she clearly had an urgent goal to complete, it wouldn't have been easy for me to chase her out of the city. The East Sea King nodded calmly. It was he the one who fought Evangeline and forced her back after inflicting a medium-grade wound on her left shoulder, inadvertently causing Bai Zemin's plan to go down the drain. Let's go back to Krya City. There's nothing to see or do here. The East Sea King looked down at the bottom of the sea and shook his head before turning around to leave. Before leading the way back to the city, however, the East Sea King stopped and looked at Meng Qi with a serious expression. Young lady, you have a really good brother. I am aware of. Meng Qi responded, bowing slightly as a show of respect to the other party. At the end of the day, the status of the man in front of her was equivalent to that of her brother Bai Zemin, and what Meng Qi least wanted was to cause trouble for her family. The king nodded and soon continued on his way with the rest, following not far behind. Hey, big sister Mayor. Can I ask a question? A little mermaid with silky smooth blonde hair approached, waving her emerald green tail gracefully. She, as was very normal among non-combat mermaids, had 2 beautiful seashells covering her chest area and some jewels, but other than that her upper body was uncovered and exposing her white skin to everyone's eyes. Her body was very petite, like that of a kid, evoking tenderness instead of bizarre thoughts. Her name was Xian Baobao. She was the 9th princess of the East Sea. She was only 34 years old, and although 34 years old was a lot from a normal human's point of view, she was actually equivalent to a little kid of 7 years old among the sea creatures, as they developed slower but lived longer after developing intelligence. Xietain Meier really liked this younger sister of hers. Xian Baobao was one of the few members who did not compete for the throne, which was obvious considering she was so young. Although most saw her as a nuisance, in Xietain Meier's eyes she was like a beautiful pearl, being as innocent as a newborn and having no evil in her heart. Xian Baobao looked at Meng Qi with her big blue eyes filled with curiosity and asked in a low voice, what were you talking about before with Royal Father? Is this big sister's big brother really that good? That's... Xietain Meier didn't know what to say about it. Actually, everyone had understood the meaning behind the king's words. But little Xian Baobao was too innocent to think of such things. The reason why the East Sea King said those words to Meng Qi earlier was that if not for Bai Zemin's existence, Meng Qi's life would not be guaranteed in the sea. Simply put, the East Sea King did not want to go to war against a human kingdom that had already managed to establish in a year's time since the beginning of the apocalypse. Especially considering that the king of the said human kingdom had the ability to fight and kill Tao Xi, regardless of whether he did so with help. The East Sea King did not downplay this feat, since he would also have no chance of winning against Tao Xi in a one-on-one battle. It was precisely this reason why Bai Zemin retreated to the collector's pocket world, and although the East Sea King did not know where he had gone, he certainly understood and praised his clever reasoning. If Bai Zemin had appeared before the East Sea King in his badly wounded state, things might have been different. But if he appeared after recovering enough to fear nothing, then the East Sea King would think twice before making any moves against him. Meanwhile, Meng Qi would definitely not be in danger after the East Sea King learned that she was the sister of the King of China. On the other hand, at the same time that Bai Zemin was retreating with serious injuries, he did not know that his beloved was in a critical situation while fighting her own battle, just the same way she did not know that her loved one was a hair's breadth away from dying on 2 occasions. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 999, An Existence Cloaked in Mystery. Somewhere in outer space, within the boundaries of the Wall of Chaos, the war between the demonic army and the invaders coming from beyond the abyssal rift, from the mysterious place called the Golden Domain, not only continued but became fiercer and fiercer with each passing second. Although it seemed as if the energy used by the invaders was stronger than the mana used by the defenders, for some reason the defenders proved to be more powerful in a 1 versus 1 battle, and in most cases, it took 2 or even 3 invaders to fight as equals against any one member of the demonic army. Although the 5th and 6th orders were fighting their own war, a portion of everyone's attention was focused on 4 other battlefields that in some sense were more important, as any change there would mean that an even bigger change in the overall war would soon begin. These battlefields were naturally where the generals of each army were clashing with each other with increasingly murderous and vicious attacks, despite the fact that the wounds of each of them kept piling up one after another. However, there were only a few seconds in which, as if by prior agreement, they all stopped attacking each other. All for the sake of looking towards a battlefield in the distance. Lilith. Crow choked on his next words as he stared wide-eyed into the distance. Ha ha ha. That fucking bitch finally got what she deserves. Han Jian laughed darkly as he took the opportunity to look at his severed left arm, which caused him to grimace in hatred and pain. The members of the demonic army despaired as they saw an enemy sword cleanly piercing Lilith's chest, right in the area where the heart was located. Even higher existences could not live long with a pierced heart. This kind of wound was considered fatal for both lower existences and higher existences. The only difference was that piercing the heart of a higher existence was far more difficult. While the members of the demonic army despaired, the enemies of the Golden Domain cheered with delight. Lilith had been like a goddess on the battlefield, and her skills, as well as her ability to effect large-scale warfare, were qualities that literally began the enemy's undoing. Therefore, while her allies saw her as a divine goddess, her enemies could not wait to tear her flesh into 1,000 pieces. It was just that no enemy dared to approach carelessly after several of them, even some of the strongest, fell under her control. But at the sight of the embodiment of the demon itself being severely wounded, the entire Golden Domain trembled with excitement. Lilith seemed unaware of all the cries of surprise and terror from her allies. She didn't even seem to be bothered by the cruel mockery of her enemies. Her focus was solely on her current situation and not on what others thought or felt about it. My heart was completely pierced. This is really a tough situation. Lilith realized that she really might die here if she didn't do something soon. Die? She? Lilith could not allow such a thing to happen. She had not only not completed her goal that she had been fighting for so long, but now she had a very important reason to live for, not for a goal, but for herself and her own happiness together with someone she really loved. However, it wasn't that easy. Young lady, you have caused a lot of disturbance. Lilith heard the voice of the wrinkled old man behind her sounding like 2 sandpaper rubbing against each other, extremely unpleasant to the ears. Her expression suddenly changed, and a flash of panic finally shone in her beautiful ruby eyes as she felt the metal blade digging into her heart begin to grow in temperature and buzz. She probably had no more than 2 to 3 seconds before she died. How was a person with a pierced heart and under the grip and gaze of a much more powerful enemy supposed to even escape? All right, Zemin. A glimmer of hope shone amidst the despair as Lilith remembered her loved one. The wrinkled, sunken-eyed old man didn't seem worried at all, which was completely normal, considering that the female under his control was simply too weak to do anything that could affect him in the slightest. He looked at Lucifer in the distance and said in a hoarse voice, "It's been a while, Demon Lord Lucifer." Lucifer did not respond as he was trying to find a solution to this big problem. He had been overconfident this time and was caught off guard. In the past, the most the enemy sent apart from many normal enemies were 2 generals, beings capable of fighting against 7th-order higher existences. Lucifer had foreseen that this invasion would be different, so he was not surprised when 4 or 5 generals appeared. He was not even surprised when someone comparable to a soul evolver of 8th-order initial stage appeared. But Lucifer certainly never, even in his wildest dreams, imagined that the enemy would send a second being of such magnitude. The abyssal rift had widened beyond his estimation and events were spiraling out of control. As he felt the enemy's power rising higher and higher, Lucifer clenched his fists, feeling for the first time in a long time frustrated and angry. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do in this situation. Even if the bloody succubus heart hadn't been pierced, I can't make a move without that old fucker noticing. Lucifer gritted his teeth secretly before looking at Lilith, with apologetic eyes. It was impossible for him to move and get to Lilith faster than the old man. Just at the last moment when the old man was rejoicing at the sight of the enemy leader's expression, his expression froze along with his movements. Absolute frozen domain. These 3 words sounded like a practically inaudible whisper, but in the old man's ears, they sounded as loud as a thunderclap in the middle of a beautiful spring afternoon. Before he could increase his power outflow to turn the enemy female's body into a pile of meat paste, making her explode, everything around him seemed to shut down for a brief moment, and when his senses returned to normal his expression sank. The old man looked ahead with an ugly expression on his face, but there was also confusion in his eyes as he saw that his sword extended forward was stained with blood, but his enemy was no longer there. "How did you do that?" he asked in a shadowy voice as he looked at Lilith from over 1,000 meters away. What? Lim Qinyu, as well as everyone else, looked on with wide eyes. That powerful elder was really asking something like that? They had all watched as Lilith simply stepped off the edge of the sword, moving forward and cutting through space to appear 1,000 meters away. The old man just stood there and did nothing to stop her. The old man did not charge at Lilith again. His opportunity was gone as Lucifer was now standing in front of her and looking at him with a dark expression on his handsome face. The old man's expression only improved a little at the thought that this female would die soon anyway. Her heart had been pierced from side to side, so her fate was sealed. "Fire sorrow!" Lucifer bellowed with his eyes fixed on the old man and not daring to let him out of his sight. "Lucia, I need you to hold on for a while." Fire sorrow called out as she looked towards the fiercest battlefield. There, Lucia and Xiongli were exchanging blows, practically at the speed of light. Both were moving so fast that only Lucifer and the old man who stabbed Lilith's heart could see their movements with clarity. The explosions caused by each clash of their weapons were getting more and more dreadful. No one dared to even try to get close to those 2 monsters. However, Lucia was slightly at a disadvantage. Even then, she should have no trouble holding out for a considerable amount of time, and Fire Sorrow could afford to turn her attention to something more urgent. Fire Sorrow pulled a pill from her storage ring and handed it to Lilith. "Lilith, quickly swallow it." Her voice sounded anxious, which was natural, considering that half of a previously black combat dress was now red due to the blood running out of Lilith's chest. Lilith tossed the red-colored pill into her mouth at the same time as Fire Sorrow pointed with her magic staff. Hex of Greater Healing. Hex of Greater Healing was a spell learned by Fire Sorrow, not a skill gained through skill scrolls. This spell was very powerful. Not only could it restore lost limbs in a matter of minutes, but it also had a relatively low consumption. It had taken her nearly 800 years to learn this skill. Indeed, Fire Sorrow was not disappointed when the bleeding began to diminish. However, her expression slowly began to change as she realized that while the bleeding was slowing, it was still far from stopping, not to mention healing the wound on Lilith's chest. Fire Sorrow stayed calm and tried using other skills. However, the more time passed, the more serious her expression became. Fire Sorrow had been able to heal pierced hearts of allies in the past, and she was sure that she could heal any wound of any being weaker than her. The problem was that while it was true that Lilith was a 6th-order soul evolver, her true capacity was much higher, and thus the main records of her existence were much more difficult to recover after being damaged. /N, I made a change to Lilith's level and forgot to remind you, sorry. Chapter Dragon Slayer, Lucia. Lilith's expression was ice cold, but only she knew how grateful she was to Zemin and Callie for the earring she wore on her right ear. Leaving aside how amazing the earring was in general, it was its special skill what saved Lilith from death. Absolute Frozen Domain uses the full power of the earring, rendering it useless for 48 hours to activate. Effect creates a time domain 2 meters around the user, freezing everything except the user itself for 0.5 seconds. This effect cannot be avoided, ignored, or broken regardless of the difference in level, order, or power between the user and the enemies. 0.5 seconds may not be much, but for existences capable of moving so fast and even slightly manipulating space, that amount of time could make the difference between who lived and who died, as had just happened to Lilith seconds before. By Xietan's blacksmithing, Kali's runes, and the efforts of both, two first-order lower existences had unknowingly intervened in a great war in which higher existences were falling like flies, saving Lilith's life in the process. No, Lilith's life was not out of danger yet. She looked at her heart and noticed a malicious energy, preventing it from fully healing. Lilith immediately knew that Fire Sorrow would not be able to heal her, and at this rate, she would end up bleeding to death. "I can't afford to die. Not now." Lilith sighed and whispered the activation of a skill in her heart. Fire Sorrow was beginning to sweat nervously, but just then she noticed a flash of dark green light surrounding Lilith's heart, and her expression went from nervous to surprised. "Would nature-type energy?" Fire Sorrow looked at Lilith in shock and said incredulously, "Lilith, you." Wood-type energy was rare in itself, and few higher existences had it. All of them were usually very powerful healers. However, the wood-type energy that came from nature itself was even rarer, as it could not be obtained unless one linked with the Tree of Life, and among all the higher existences only Archangel Gabriel had it. Fire Sorrow was in shock upon discovering that Lilith actually had such a power, and could not understand how such a thing was possible. Lilith's expression was cold. She held her left hand, which was surrounded by a layer of light, near her chest, slowly but surely regenerating her heart and chest at the same time. She wiped the blood from the corner of her lips, using her free hand, and looked at the enemies of the Golden Domain. For the first time in a long time, she felt nothing but fury in her chest, and she was certainly going to take it out on the culprits. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 1000. Blood as precious as an elixir. Collector's Pocket World. Xietain appeared in his room when he activated the skill of the Collector's Pocket Watch. He couldn't help but feel grateful for this fact. It would have been a bit awkward to appear before Wu Yijun and Shangguan Bingshui completely naked. Although, considering his current situation, probably no one would care. His upper body was covered in bloody wounds, some holes were so terrifying that they were halfway deep. Xietain could even see part of his liver if he leaned forward a little, but he had no desire to see such a thing. Worst of all, however, and without a doubt, were his arm and leg. Xietan's left arm was completely gone almost from the shoulder all the way down, and although he still had his left thigh relatively healthy, the rest of his leg had exploded during the battle against Tao Ji. With great difficulty, Xietain put on a pair of shorts to cover his lower body, and then went out into the courtyard using blood chains to move like a certain villain from a certain movie of a certain superhero able to climb buildings like a spider. Xietain met Shangguan Bingshui and Wu Yijun. The two were trying to recover while looking at the three unconscious on the ground. Seeing him arrive, Wu Yijun explained, "We helped Auntie and Evangeline drink potions to support their recovery. But we're having problems with Kong Jun. His body is practically completely paralyzed, and he doesn't even move subconsciously." Shangguan Bingshui pointed out with a frown, "All the potions were forced out when he coughed instead of swallowing. The same thing that happened with you in Oblong World." Xietain nodded as he approached Kong Jun. "Oblong World? Bingshui, you were injured to the point where you couldn't drink potions?" Wu Yijun looked at her good sister in confusion. "This? Yijun, about that." Shangguan Bingshui hesitated at the same time as in her heart she cursed Xietain. Xietain naturally had no ill intentions or strange motives when he said what he said. His attention was focused on Kong Jun as he needed to be treated as soon as possible. First things come first. He took out a health potion capable of increasing the body's natural recovery rate by 25% for 120 minutes and opened Kong Jun's mouth before spewing the contents inside. "Oh no, you won't." Xietain quickly used blood manipulation when he saw Kong Jun about to cough out the precious liquid, and investing a good amount of mana managed to control the throat muscles of the mighty weaver ant, forcing him to swallow the elixir. The change was immediate as the speed and effectiveness at which Kong Jun's stem cells recovered and worked to form new tissues, and these tissues gradually tried to regenerate the damaged organs, increased considerably. Unfortunately, after a minute or two, Xietain noticed that the power of the recovery potion was not enough. The energy from that damn beam is still in Kong Jun's blood and flesh, continuously nullifying the effort of his stem cells. Xietain frowned, but a second later his expression returned to normal. Under the confused and perplexed eyes of the two women beside him, Bai Zemin knelt down beside Kong Jun and then extended his right hand until his palm was in front of the guardian's open mouth. What are you dash? Ah. Shangguan Bingshui was forced to swallow her words at the same time as her pupils contracted slightly while Wu Yijuan covered her mouth, letting out a muffled cry. Actually, I am no longer completely human. Ah, I meant I'm not even a normal soul evolver at this point. To be honest, I don't know how to explain it. Bai Zemin watched as his red blood with a faint golden tinge fell like a waterfall from his outstretched palm and his face grew paler and paler as he weakly said, well, to say that my entire body is a treasure for a comparatively normal race like ants is not an exaggeration. In less than 20 seconds, Bai Zemin had lost practically half of the blood left in his body and only then did he stop. This really is crazy, he said, gasping for air as he slowly let himself rest on his back. If I was a human, I would have definitely died. Fuck its mother, I think I have like 1 liter of blood running through my body or so. Wu Yijuan, with a face as pale as a sheet not only from the lack of mana but mainly from the fear she felt, quickly knelt down next to Bai Zemin and prepared to help him. However, he stopped her. Yijuan, help Evangeline first, please. Bai Zemin was so weak that his voice was no more than a whisper. I am fine. You are fine? You are dying. Wu Yijuan glared at him with tears in her eyes, but besides pain and fear there was also anger in her usually innocent and loving gaze. When you started to become warmer and kinder I was happy. But now you always end up like this. I know it's not right, but sometimes I really wish you would stop risking your life even if others have to die. Bai Zemin looked at her through his half-closed eyelids and couldn't stop the corner of his lips from curling slightly into a practically invisible smile. Really, she's a great woman. For the first time, Bai Zemin admitted when he was on the verge of fainting that maybe, just maybe, he might become a little uncomfortable to see a man monopolizing such kindness and gentleness. Before fainting, Bai Zemin used what little will he had left to tap into his spatial storage ring and pull out a skill scroll. At the same time as his eyes closed, the skill scroll exploded into particles of light as it came into contact with his hand, and in an instant all those particles of light entered his body, soul, and formed a new rune. You have learned the passive active skill, Restoration. You have 19 free slots to learn active skills. Wu Yijuan gritted her teeth and shook her head. You can get angry later if you want. She was very sorry for Evangeline as she really liked her even though they hadn't talked much. In fact, it could be said that Wu Yijuan considered her a friend. But between Evangeline's life and Bai Zemin's, the priorities in the Asian beauty's heart were more than clear. Yijuan, wait. What? Wu Yijuan looked at her best friend who had just stopped her. Her expression was not particularly kind and her words were not directed in the form of a question, but of annoyance. Shangguan Bingshui couldn't help but smile bitterly at the sight of the usually gentle Wu Yijuan's annoyed expression. It was as if her 2 arms turned to dust and the wounds on her body didn't matter at all, although truth be told, her injuries weren't really serious, with the biggest problem being the pulverized bones on her 2 arms. Cool your head a bit, busty girl. Shangguan Bingshui sighed and nodded forward. Take a good look. Wu Yijuan frowned slightly and looked at Bai Zemin's body attentively as she was suggested to do. It was then that she realized that Bai Zemin had not made his earlier decision as hastily as it might have seemed. What's it all about? Around Bai Zemin, small crimson-colored particles seemed to form seemingly out of nowhere and like magnets of opposite poles were attracted to him. These particles of light were absorbed by Bai Zemin's body, and it was not difficult at all to notice how very slowly his aura began to stabilize. In fact, Wu Yijuan and Shangguan Bingshui noticed that the blood he had lost before was being replenished very quickly. It seems that Bai Zemin's evolution was not just a class evolution. The reason it took him so long to break through was because of those absurd requirements, but looking at this kind of power I think it's understandable. Even his original race was modified. Shangguan Bingshui looked at Kong Jun and noticed that Kong Jun's severe wounds were slowly starting to stabilize thanks to the blood Bai Zemin had fed him. I wonder if I will undergo such a great change when I advance to 3rd order. Shangguan Bingshui wondered. However, thinking better on a particular requirement that the soul record was asking her to complete in order to advance. Although I'm likely to be stuck even forever, she sighed. Trying to put such thoughts aside for later, Shangguan Bingshui lay down next to Bai Zemin and closed her eyes as she said softly, I can feel the surrounding mana being absorbed into him to help him recover. I wonder if it has something to do with the skill scroll Xietain learned a minute ago, or if it is due to a feature of his class in particular. Wu Yijun looked at Xietain and subconsciously clenched her fists. In the previous battle, I was able to do practically nothing. Shangguan Bingshui softly opened her blue eyes and looked at her friend standing up and walking towards Evangeline. I thought all my life that the day I loved someone I would never get to feel unworthy or less than, but with each passing day I realize how stupid my thoughts were. Not only can I not help the one I most want to help, I can't even fight shoulder to shoulder with you, Bingshui. In our entire faction, you are probably the one who is best suited to him on the battlefield. Wu Yijun stretched her hands forward and whispered, revitalize. Shangguan Bingshui watched as all the grass and the few trees in sight suddenly glowed with a faint light green glow, and moments later, a ball of light of the same shade of green covered both of Wu Yijun's hands. Soon, Evangeline's body began to improve and it surely wouldn't be long before she was out of the mortal danger zone. Shangguan Bingshui slowly closed her eyes and whispered in her heart, Yijun, you are very powerful and impressive. It's just that your forte is not in fighting particularly strong enemies. But there are things that neither I, nor Xietain, nor any other member of our faction can do, but you can. Just as Shangguan Bingshui was about to rest and relax now that things were mostly settled, her friend's somewhat anxious voice brought her back to reality. Bingshui, is it me, or... Is it just me, or has Xietan's hair changed?